In a universe that almost is, just out of reach beyond the edge of reality, mysterious forces underlie the fabric of existence. Energematrice6, the very energy of creation, serves as both the elixir of life and the arsenal of destruction for its human and not-so-human denizens.
Crushing darkness, whose source they cannot fathom, grips the cosmos and its people. In anguish, they dream of the long-foretold bright star.
Join us as we embark on an epic journey, exploring the universe of Energematrice6.
And welcome, everybody. This is episode 30 of the Energematrice6 podcast, and we are live everywhere that it's cooperating, and that's good. Welcome, Mel. Welcome, Luke. Oldest, second, and third. We've got most of our cast here today, and we are reading The Veil of Mysteries, Chapter 7. Before we get to that, I'm going to hit the V for VAD, but I'm also going to be in Utah this week and in South Dakota both at homeschool conferences. So Utah this weekend and South Dakota next weekend. And we're going to have to see what we can do after that for the next week's episode, because that one's going to be interesting. So we'll stay tuned on that one. Anyway, hang on just a second. We will get going here. The Energematrice6 podcast operates on a value-for-value model. That means that we hope if we provide some value to you in your life, that you'll return that to us in whatever way you can manage. If you're interested, head over to e6universe.com and sign up for our email list to get our free ebooks, and hopefully buy a physical book or some merch while you're there. Or if all you can manage right now is to leave us a good review somewhere, 5 stars or some kind of positive rating, that's more than appreciated. Thank you. All right. And that is our cue, I guess. So this is The Veil of Mysteries, Chapter 7. The most powerful torment finds its origin in uncertainty. Tell them nothing. Lastus Rallan to Lena Trent, attributed during the betrayal. There were 2 other notable finds over the next hour. Most of the rooms they checked had obviously been used for colonists first, with the mounting points and plumbing for cold sleep chambers still sticking through the floor and walls, capped off or coiled and secured with ancient congealed rigger tape. There were also dust patterns on just about every surface that showed they had later been used for storage, probably of artifacts that Paul eventually removed based on half-visible shapes in the dust. As he emerged from the crawlway to yet another deck below, a sharp exclamation drew Nate down a main passage. A moment later, the cry repeated, even sharper and more insistent.
No, don't!
It was Shauna's voice. Again, Nate followed her cry to a completely unmarked side chamber that at first seemed exactly like all the others. The walls and ceiling were the same as any other compartment, but then Nate saw something that instinctively made him reach out to grasp a handhold in the corridor wall. In the center of the room, a column of something shiny jutted out of the floor. It wasn't metal, some kind of glass or crystal, perhaps? Atop it sat a gem that was roughly the size of Nate's head. It was so dark that it drank in all the light that surrounded it, looking more like a hole in reality than a crystal. Nate could see its facets only on one side, where the light reflected faintly from the sheer surface. The more immediate concern was Kevin, who stood transfixed before it, his hand outstretched. Nate had arrived just in time, or he might not have believed what he saw. Wisps of darkness reached out from that pitch-black void to meet Keevan's fingertips, as if drawing him in to touch it. He might have been sleepwalking, his motions slow and clumsy, as he shuffled toward the strange object. Then he did touch it. When his skin contacted the gem, his body went completely rigid. His head swiveled slowly, menacingly toward Shauna, who stood just out of Nate's view from the corridor, inside the edge of the doorway. The voice that issued from Keevan's lips was far too deep for his small frame. Luke, you want to do this part?
Sure, I can do that.
How deep can you make it?
So long in the dark.
You mind doing it again so I'm not talking?
Not bad. I didn't realize you were. My bad. So long in the dark.
Shauna was silent, as if whatever she saw in Keevan's eyes had rendered her speechless. Nate's mind was racing, but he too was frozen in place, not sure how to respond. Keevan spoke again.
I am Jazoriel.
Then, after a moment,
How did you come to my prison, human?
Shauna let out a strangled gasp, but still didn't speak. With barely a pause, Jazriel spoke again, its tone unmistakably impatient.
Humans. Were it possible, I had forgotten how stupid and weak you are. Though the Maker's fiends locked us away so long ago, still I should have remembered.
Nate stepped forward into the doorway so he could see Shauna more clearly. She was gasping and clutching at her throat, and some movement of her hand must have brought the amulet hanging there to the creature's attention, because its next words seemed almost excited.
What? What is this? Who made you, little pretty? What luck? Locked away. I see. But such power. Such power.
The final, almost reverent note of Jazriel's monologue was cut short as Nate drifted forward through the doorway, and Keevan's head whipped around to stare at him. It was indeed his eyes that shocked Nate the most. They were completely black, sucking in the light like the gem to which Keevan's hand was still affixed. His face was stuck in a rigid, grinning mask, almost like a caricature of a clown. Nate shivered involuntarily as those eyes widened even further, the horrifying, light-devouring blackness eating yet more of Keevan's face. The harsh, sibilant voice, still far too deep and completely wrong for Keevan's vocal cords, assaulted him directly.
Who are you? What are you?
The huge black eyes narrowed, which felt somehow even worse than before, as if all the malevolent attention in the universe was focused through their slitted aperture.
You. The one? I should have guessed.
It paused, thinking, then howled.
But how can this be? Do they know? Did they foresee?
He stared for another He stared for another long, frozen moment and let out a shriek so unearthly that Nate and Shauna both gave a violent start.
The worm tricked me. From the very beginning it knew. Even before I was cursed to sightless imprisonment in this mortal hell. For this, my children, my race will die. This cannot stand. It must not stand.
With that, Keevan moved so quickly Nate barely registered what he was doing. He certainly didn't have time to react before Keevan had lifted the enormous, faceted gem and hurled it straight at Nate's head. Instinctively, in the nick of time, Nate reached up to slap the huge gem out of the air, but was barely fast enough. There was a brilliant flash when his hand contacted it, leaving spots dancing in his vision, and somehow the flash reached beyond the spectrum of visible light. Nate's awareness of Energematrice6 was pierced with the same bright hole as his vision. The black gem, meanwhile, clanged off the metal bulkhead to his right and floated off into the middle of the room. Kevin dove for the object with a cry, but Shauna saw what he was doing and pushed off to intercept. She slammed into him, and the two hit the bulkhead in a tangle of arms and legs as Nate's vision began to clear. Kevin squawked. "Come on, Shauna. We got to take it with us. It's calling to me. I'm telling you." He tried to disentangle himself, his eyes still fixed on the gem floating across the room behind Shauna. "Kevin," Nate barked. "What in the world is the matter with you?" Oh. "Kevin," Nate barked. "What in the void is the matter with you?"
Nate, help!
Shauna's tone was fearful, and she clung desperately to Kevin's arm. Nate pushed off toward the gem where it floated across the room. As he traveled, he turned slowly toward Kevin, rotating his body. When he spun past, something in the surface of the gem caught his eye and seemed to stare back at him, leering. There was no time to wonder over it, though. "Kevin, snap out of it!" Nate's tone was commanding, but Kevin continued to babble. "We gotta take it with us! Can't you see? It's..." Kevin cut off as Nate came between him and the gem. "I think not," Nate said. "In fact, Kevin, go see what else you can find. Now." Kevin frowned and started to open his mouth again, but then he really saw the look on Nate's face, and finally awareness penetrated his near mania. He blinked in surprise, then frowned uncertainly and shook his head as if to clear it. I guess. Yeah, okay." He turned reluctantly away and pushed off toward the hatch where they'd come in, rubbing his palm. Shauna turned to stare at the gem as Nate touched down on the wall and rebounded back toward the door, his own wary gaze now fixed on the gem as it floated in the back corner of the room. She asked in a quiet voice,
What is it?"
Nate's expression was bleak. "I'm not precisely sure, but I don't think it's something I want any of us touching ever again." Kevin didn't wait for them outside the hatch, instead swinging into another room down the corridor. Once he and Shauna were both outside, Nate closed the hatch himself and locked it, keying a code into the electronic lock. Shauna looked at Nate, frowning.
Was that one of them caught in that gem?
Nate stared back at her, frowning in thought, then shrugged. "Or something worse. I wish I knew. Or maybe I don't." He shook his head. "No safer place for it than here, and I'm not taking it with us." One final find from Laura distracted them. She came from yet another room, yet another level down, holding what at first looked like a fist-sized cylinder. When she handed it to Nate, however, it became obvious that it was a set of discs, bound together by an unseen force. When Nate examined the object with Energematrice6, he couldn't tell whether it was intended to use the fields directly or simply drew on them to retain its integrity. There was Energematrice6 flowing through it, but the configuration was strange, and it didn't respond to Nate's prodding. Nate shrugged and agreed that it too should be taken along. The room in which Laura had found the discs was another puzzle. It was a storage room, but none of the other objects inside were directly linked to Energematrice6 in any unusual fashion. They were just ordinary gems or simple machines, like a microscope and a bank of decrepit computers. A cursory examination of the rest of the ship yielded nothing of note. They were all getting tired, but John and Rachel were still in their father's old cabin. When Nate went to check on them, he found them just sitting, staring at a metal ring that hung in the air between them. It was a plain band with no inscription or markings, but tears spilled from Rachel's eyes and hovered in tiny droplets around her face. John looked heartsick. Rachel saw Nate and let out a choked sob.
It's his wedding ring. He left it for us. He's gone.
She broke down again, crying quietly. John grimaced, then said, without looking at Nate,
He loved Mom so much. He never let her go. Even though she died when we were too young to remember, he talked about her all the time like she was still there.
Nate closed the hatch behind him and floated there, looking at the ring thoughtfully. After a long moment, John continued.
The fact that he left that for us means he really thought he was going to die. There's no other reason he would have done it.
He turned toward Nate, his face drained of color. Rachel dashed the tears from her eyes, using one hand to steady herself, and shook her head.
He can't be. He just can't. We'll find him.
Nate pushed off gently from where he clung to the hatch and caught himself next to Rachel, then enfolded her in a hug made awkward by the lack of gravity. Is that what he'd want you to do? Rachel sighed.
No, of course not. He told us not to, but we can't give up on him.
Nate bit his lip, but he shook his head. Rach, you're not giving up on him. If I know you at all, you never will. But you only have so much time in this world. What was your dad doing with his time? Rachel raised one hand in denial, but then she looked Nate right in the eyes, and he could feel her heart breaking as she answered.
He was fighting against the evil Lastus released into the world. His whole life, that's all he did. Fight to save people from it and fight to save people from it and fight it himself. But there was never anybody to look after him.
Nate nodded, frowning. So, what did he want you to do? Rachel shook her head, obviously resisting what she said even as she said it.
He always said, there are only two paths in life. We can fight against evil or fight for it, whether by action or inaction.
She stopped for a moment, then looked at Nate through tear-fogged eyes.
He said those were the only two choices we have.
Nate nodded again, grimly. He was right, and so are you. Someone should take care of him. Nate paused, giving Rachel another squeeze, then reaching over to lay a hand on John's arm. Be sure what you choose to do doesn't waste the time you have. Rachel finally hugged Nate back, fiercely. When she stopped, Nate released her, allowing himself to drift toward the ceiling as she turned to regard her father's ring again, her face finally relaxing. Nate pushed off of the ceiling to flip himself around and move toward the door. Behind him, Rachel said quietly,
He wanted us to help you when you arrive, and we will.
He turned his head as he reached the door and nodded to her with a grave, quiet smile. We have so much to do. You can't even imagine. The trip back to Adamant was mostly uneventful, though they could find no simple way to move the artifact that controlled the Veil, which was christened unimaginatively by Ty, the Globe of the Veil. After some discussion, Ty volunteered to hold it, while they towed him across the gap with a length of line. That accomplished, they went through the process of cycling through Adamant's airlock yet again. Once back aboard, Nate went to secure the Globe of the Veil in his own cabin. At first, he couldn't find an appropriate place to put it. It was just large enough that none of the storage compartments, even the closet, would fit it. Eventually, he decided that securing it to the sleeping couch with the restraint netting was his best option. That done, he made his way to the bridge, where Andrew was examining the other's amulets with fascination. Smiling, Nate offered him a choice of the remaining 4. Nate looked nervous at first, even quickly passing his hand over each to feel the Energematrice6 flowing through them left him sweating.
I said Nate instead of Andrew.
Oh. Andrew looked nervous at first, even quickly passing his hand over each to feel the Energematrice6 flowing through them left him sweating, but he seemed genuinely grateful when he chose the yellow amulet. He put it on and it lit up with a soft golden light. Andrew, Nate asked, what's bothering you? Andrew's lips twisted.
I used to be good at this.
Nate simply waited while Andrew sat staring at his new amulet. After a long moment, Andrew said,
I almost killed myself. We always just called it overexertion. It's what you call entropic shock. It was when we were running away. Back home? Makes me wish I had one of those.
He eyed Nate's recamacula dolefully. Nate nodded and Andrew shook his head.
It was bad. There was no time to rest when I did it, and ever since
He shook his head again.
I can hardly stand to open my senses to it. I know it's all in my head, but I just can't.
Shauna spoke up from where she was strapped in.
Andy, you saved us so many times. Whatever you can't do, it's not because you're weak.
Andrew barked a laugh.
Oh, I don't have any regrets. I did what I had to do. But now?
He shrugged helplessly, then looked up into Nate's eyes.
I can barely stand to even look at it now.
Nate nodded. We'll find a way to help you. There isn't time right now, but we will find a way. John looked at Andrew sadly.
I can't heal entropic shock, you know. I've tried.
Ty snorted.
You and everybody else.
Can you make that a little more emphatic? You and everybody else.
You and everybody else.
He smiled sympathetically at Andrew.
Just be glad you didn't hurt yourself physically. The physical part is even harder to heal than the mental part. Professors could help people whose minds were stuck, like yours.
As they all secured themselves for travel, Rachel stared through the great window at Hope 1 from 2 seats to Nate's left.
I almost wish I could stay.
Next to her, John asked gently.
And do what, Rach?
She shook her head mutely as Laura laid a hand on her arm from the other side. Laura's eyes were more than a bit haunted as she turned to Rachel.
I know how you feel.
She squeezed Rachel's hand. John, too, squeezed her hand, and Rachel turned her head to give him a crooked grin.
At least we're not trapped in a crystal anymore.
Speaking of which, Nate was frowning. We had a little incident aboard Hope. He relayed to them all what had happened with Kevin and Shauna and the Black Gem. When he'd finished, Kevin was staring at him as if he'd never seen him before. I don't remember any of that. Kevin shook his head absent-mindedly, rubbing his hand. I swear, I would never. He looked troubled and shook his head again, almost reflexively. Nate nodded grimly. It was messing with your mind. If you'd seen what we saw, well, he shrugged. Shauna looked scared, presumably at even the memory of what had happened. I'd never. Kevin seemed almost desperate now, and Jesse reached over to lay a hand on his shoulder.
It's all right, Ink. You have friends around you.
Kevin looked at Jesse, nonplussed, and laughed aloud. Imagine a Galton saying that to me. Am I dreaming? Jesse smiled, but Kevin's own gaze had turned inward, presumably to his own memories. After regarding Kevin thoughtfully, Jesse looked over to Nate.
I'm glad you asked me along, Bright Star.
Nate looked at Jesse quizzically. I asked? That was Rebus' idea. His lips twisted ironically. Not that I mind having you along. You were more than welcome. Jesse had gone pale, though, and he shook his head.
We have to get back. Rebus is up to something, and we have to stop him.
Nate sighed, returning Jesse's alarmed stare with a resigned one. We'll head back, but based on what you just said, Rebus was trying hard to get you out of the way. Don't be surprised if our welcome is worn out. Jesse shook his head again, stubbornly.
My father would never allow something like this. Rebus is going too far.
Could you hit that again?
Yeah,
You had
I bumped something, sorry.
Yeah.
My father would never allow something like this. Rebus is going too far.
When they had all settled in, Andrew took the helm to head them all back toward Lighthouse Station. The trip back through Hope 1's collision field was slow, and might have been painfully dull if they weren't all exhausted from their search. As it was, every one of them was in a near stupor as Andrew inched them back out of Hope 1's field, and then turned his attention to navigating around the primary toward Lighthouse Station. As they traveled, Nate studied the clouds of the veil around them. Was there less movement? Less density? He wasn't certain, but it seemed to him that there must be. Or he was imagining it. How could he compare when he hadn't known to look in the first place? That ends Chapter 7 of The Veil of Mysteries. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Mel. Oldest, second, third. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to our listeners. And we will catch you all next week.